You're controlled by primitive instincts constantly, making irrational decisions driven by ancient brain circuits designed for survival, not success. Choosing immediate gratification over long-term gains, reacting emotionally when strategic thinking is required, falling for cognitive biases that sabotage every important decision, and remaining unable to think clearly because your primitive brain hijacks rational thought the moment pressure appears. This primitive brain control is systematically destroying your potential by ensuring poor decisions compound into failed outcomes, destroying your opportunities by making you reactive instead of strategic, destroying your relationships through emotional reactions, replacing thoughtful responses, destroying your finances through impulsive choices, overriding careful planning, and destroying your future by guaranteeing primitive instincts control you rather than intelligent thinking, guiding your life. Smart thinking is not intelligence you're born with, but capacity to override primitive instincts through systematic training. Not about never feeling impulses, but about not being controlled by them. And not mysterious ability, but result of specific practices anyone can implement. This audiobook teaches smart thinking mastery through the framework for outsmarting primitive instincts, the neuroscience of dual processing systems showing how primitive and rational brains compete, the psychology of cognitive biases revealing how instincts mislead you, the practices of deliberate rational thinking, and the strategies for maintaining smart decisions when primitive brain demands immediate reaction. Stop being controlled by primitive instincts and start thinking smart systematically. Stop making irrational decisions and start outsmarting your primitive brain. Master rational thinking, override instinctive reactions, recognize cognitive traps, execute strategic choices, and develop smart thinking capacity, making rational decisions possible that primitive control makes permanently impossible through commitment. Starting now. Chapter 1. Your primitive brain controls most decisions without you knowing. Understanding that your primitive brain controls most decisions without conscious awareness is foundational because you cannot outsmart what you don't recognize. The dual brain system demonstrates that primitive brain evolved for survival makes most decisions automatically. That rational brain is newer, slower, and requires deliberate activation. That primitive brain prioritizes immediate survival over long-term success. That most daily choices are made by primitive circuits, not conscious thought, and that recognizing primitive control is prerequisite for smart thinking. Most people remain controlled by primitive brain through never recognizing when primitive circuits are deciding, believing all decisions are rational and conscious, not understanding dual processing systems, failing to notice automatic reactions, and assuming conscious control they don't actually have. Unconscious primitive control guarantees poor decisions. Conscious recognition enables smart thinking. Recognize control or stay unconscious. Research on decision-making demonstrates that over 90% of decisions are made unconsciously by primitive brain. That conscious rational thought is minority of mental processing. That primitive brain operates faster than conscious awareness. That emotional reactions from primitive circuits happen before rational thought. And that understanding this system is essential for smart thinking. The primitive brain characteristics include focused on immediate, not long-term outcomes, driven by emotion, not logic, prioritizes survival over success, operates automatically without conscious input, controls behavior unless deliberately overridden, and makes decisions in milliseconds before rational thought engages. The rational brain characteristics show requires deliberate conscious activation, operates slower than primitive circuits, capable of strategic long-term thinking, can override primitive impulses when engaged, needs training to function consistently, and exhausts more quickly than automatic primitive processing. The recognition practice involves noticing when you react immediately without thinking, identifying decisions made emotionally rather than logically, catching yourself choosing immediate gratification automatically, recognizing when survival instincts drive inappropriate responses, becoming aware of automatic primitive control, and understanding that awareness precedes change. The cost of ignorance includes making poor decisions believing they are rational, being controlled by instincts without recognizing it, never developing capacity to override primitive circuits, remaining reactive rather than strategic, letting primitive brain sabotage important decisions, and staying unconscious of what actually drives behavior. The implementation requires studying dual processing system, understanding primitive versus rational brain, practicing awareness of automatic reactions, noticing when emotions drive decisions, recognizing primitive control in daily choices, accepting that most decisions are not consciously made, and treating recognition as foundation for smart thinking. Unconscious primitive control guarantees poor decisions. Conscious recognition enables smart thinking. Recognize control or stay unconscious. You understand now that primitive brain makes most decisions automatically, that rational thought is minority of processing, that recognition of primitive control is essential first step, that awareness enables eventual override, and that Chapter 1 creates foundation by revealing how primitive brain operates, making conscious, smart thinking possible where unconscious control made it impossible. Chapter 2, Loss aversion makes you irrationally fear risk more than seek gain. Understanding that loss aversion makes you irrationally fear risk more than seek equivalent gain reveals how primitive brain sabotages smart decisions. The loss aversion principle demonstrates that humans feel loss approximately twice as intensely as equivalent gain. That fear of losing prevents rational risk-taking. That primitive brain prioritizes avoiding loss over seeking opportunity. That this bias keeps you safe but poor, and that outsmarting loss aversion enables smart risk decisions. Most people are sabotaged by loss aversion through refusing good opportunities because they might lose, staying in bad situations to avoid loss of investment, making conservative choices that guarantee mediocrity, being paralyzed by fear of potential loss, and choosing certain small outcome over uncertain large gain. Loss aversion keeps you poor and safe. Smart thinking accepts calculated risk, override fear or stay mediocre. Research by Kahneman and Tversky demonstrates that people reject bets with 50% chance to win $200 and 50% to lose $100. Despite positive expected value, that loss aversion is hardwired primitive survival instinct, that this bias causes missed opportunities throughout life, that understanding bias does not eliminate it but enables compensation, and that smart thinking requires deliberate override of loss aversion. The manifestation in decisions includes staying in unsatisfying job to avoid loss of security, refusing to invest because you might lose, not pursuing opportunities due to fear of failure, holding losing investments to avoid accepting loss, choosing mediocre certainty over excellent uncertainty, and letting fear of loss prevent all risk-taking. The smart thinking override involves recognizing when loss aversion is driving decision, calculating actual expected value objectively, separating emotion from probability and outcome, asking what would I do if this was someone else's decision, forcing rational analysis of risk versus reward, and deliberately choosing optimal decision despite fear of loss. The reframe practice means viewing potential loss as price of opportunity, not threat, recognizing that avoiding all loss guarantees avoiding all gain, understanding that primitive fear keeps you poor, treating calculated risk as intelligence, not danger, accepting that smart thinking requires uncomfortable choices, and knowing that loss aversion sabotages wealth building. The implementation requires identifying decisions where loss aversion is controlling you, calculating objective expected value of choices, forcing yourself to consider opportunities despite fear, practicing small calculated risks, building tolerance, tracking decisions to see loss aversion patterns, and deliberately overriding primitive fear with rational analysis. Loss aversion keeps you poor and safe. Smart thinking accepts calculated risk, override fear, or stay mediocre. You understand now that primitive brain feels loss twice as intensely as gain, that this bias prevents rational risk-taking, that loss aversion keeps you in mediocrity, that smart thinking requires deliberate override, and that Chapter 2 reveals how fear of loss sabotages opportunity, making rational risk assessment possible where primitive fear made it impossible. Chapter 3, Immediate gratification impulses destroy long-term success planning. Understanding how immediate gratification impulses from primitive brain destroy long-term success planning reveals critical battle between instinct and intelligence. The gratification conflict demonstrates that primitive brain prioritizes immediate rewards over delayed larger gains. That present bias makes now feel infinitely more important than future. That impulse control is battled between primitive and rational systems. That choosing delayed gratification requires overriding powerful instincts, and that smart thinking demands resisting immediate in favor of important, Most people are sabotaged by present bias through choosing immediate pleasure over long-term benefit, unable to delay gratification for bigger rewards, making impulsive decisions that destroy future outcomes, prioritizing today's comfort over tomorrow's success, and letting primitive impulses override strategic planning. Immediate impulses destroy future success. Delayed gratification builds achievement. Delay rewards or stay impulsive. Research on temporal discounting demonstrates that people dramatically undervalue future rewards compared to immediate ones. That marshmallow test predicts life outcomes. That ability to delay gratification correlates with success across all domains. That present bias is primitive survival instinct, and that smart thinking requires systematic override of immediate impulses. The manifestation includes eating unhealthy food for immediate pleasure, despite long-term health goals, spending money impulsively instead of investing for future, choosing entertainment over important, difficult work, pursuing short-term comfort at expense of long-term achievement, and making decisions that feel good now but destroy tomorrow. The smart thinking strategies involve recognizing when immediate impulse is driving choice, forcing consideration of long-term consequences, using if-then planning to prevent impulsive decisions, creating barriers between impulse and action, removing immediate temptations from environment, making delayed option the default choice, and pre-committing to smart decisions before impulse arises. The override techniques include 10-second pause before any impulsive decision, visualizing future self affected by current choice, asking would future me thank me for this decision, using implementation intentions preventing impulse, making immediate option difficult and delayed option easy, and tracking impulsive decisions to increase awareness. The implementation requires identifying areas where immediate gratification controls you, creating specific strategies for each impulse, removing temptations from environment, pre-planning decisions before impulse arises, practicing delay in small choices, building capacity, and celebrating successful delays, reinforcing rational control. Immediate impulses destroy future success. Delayed gratification builds achievement. Delay rewards or stay impulsive. You understand now that primitive brain prioritizes immediate over important. That present bias systematically destroys long-term planning. That impulse control is essential for achievement. That delay strategies enable rational override. And that Chapter 3 reveals how immediate gratification sabotages success, making delayed gratification possible, where impulsive reactions made it impossible. Chapter 4. Confirmation bias blinds you to information contradicting beliefs. Understanding how confirmation bias blinds you to information contradicting existing beliefs reveals how primitive brain protects ego at expense of truth. The confirmation bias principle demonstrates that primitive brain seeks information confirming what you already believe. That contradicting information triggers defensive rejection. That this bias keeps you comfortable but wrong. That smart thinking requires actively seeking disconfirming evidence, and that ego protection prevents learning and growth. Most people are trapped by confirmation bias through only reading sources confirming existing views, dismissing evidence that contradicts beliefs, interpreting ambiguous information as supporting their position, remembering confirming evidence while forgetting contradicting data, and surrounding themselves with people who agree. Confirmation bias keeps you comfortable and wrong. Smart thinking seeks contradicting evidence, challenge beliefs, or stay deluded. Research on confirmation bias demonstrates that people seek confirming evidence at 4 times rate of disconfirming evidence. That this bias operates unconsciously and automatically. That intelligence does not protect against confirmation bias. That actively seeking contradicting information is only effective counter. And that remaining trapped in bias prevents smart thinking. The manifestation includes political beliefs becoming more extreme through selective information consumption, investment decisions based on confirming research ignoring warnings, relationship judgments ignoring red flags that contradict desired belief, business decisions based on optimistic data while dismissing risks, and maintaining false beliefs because contradicting information is rejected. The smart thinking override involves deliberately seeking information contradicting your beliefs, asking what would prove me wrong, and searching for that evidence, surrounding yourself with people who disagree, reading sources from opposing perspectives, treating your beliefs as hypotheses, not facts, and being genuinely curious about contradicting information. The devil's advocate practice means arguing against your own position, identifying strongest arguments opposing your view, considering how you might be wrong, seeking smart people who disagree, and listening, updating beliefs based on evidence, not ego, and treating changing your mind as strength, not weakness. The implementation requires identifying your strongest beliefs, actively searching for contradicting evidence, reading opposing viewpoints regularly, asking trusted people to challenge your thinking, tracking instances where you dismissed contradicting information, and forcing yourself to consider alternative explanations. Confirmation bias keeps you comfortable and wrong. Smart thinking seeks contradicting evidence, challenge beliefs, or stay deluded. You understand now that primitive brain seeks confirming information automatically, that contradicting evidence triggers rejection, that this bias keeps you wrong, that actively seeking disconfirming evidence is essential, and that Chapter 4 reveals how ego protection prevents learning, making truth-seeking possible, where confirmation bias made it impossible. Chapter 5, Social proof impulse makes you follow crowd into bad decisions. Understanding how social proof impulse makes you follow crowd into poor decisions reveals how primitive conformity instinct sabotages independent thinking. The social proof principle demonstrates that primitive brain uses others' behavior as shortcut for decision-making. That conformity was survival advantage in tribal past, but liability in modern decisions. That following crowd feels safe but leads to poor outcomes. That smart thinking requires resisting social proof when it conflicts with reason. And that independence from crowd is prerequisite for exceptional results. Most people are controlled by social proof through making decisions based on what others are doing, following trends without independent analysis, conforming to group beliefs to avoid social rejection, assuming crowd must be right, and unable to think independently when group pressure exists. Following crowd guarantees mediocre outcomes. Independent thinking enables exceptional results. Think independently or follow masses. Research on conformity demonstrates that Ash experiments show people deny obvious reality to conform. That social proof is one of most powerful influence triggers. That herding behavior causes market bubbles and crashes. That conformity operates automatically unless deliberately resisted. And that smart thinking requires willingness to stand alone. The manifestation includes investing in assets because everyone else is despite overvaluation, adopting beliefs of social group without examination, making consumer choices based on popularity, following career paths because they are conventional, and conforming to group consensus in meetings despite private disagreement. The smart thinking override involves recognizing when social proof is influencing decision. Asking what would I decide if I were the only person on earth, seeking data and logic rather than crowd behavior, being willing to reach different conclusion than group, treating independence as strength, not arrogance, and making decisions based on analysis, not popularity. The contrarian practice means deliberately questioning popular beliefs, analyzing why crowd might be wrong, looking for opportunities where masses are incorrect, being comfortable with unpopular correct positions, trusting analysis over consensus, and recognizing that exceptional results require different thinking. The implementation requires identifying decisions where social proof controlled you, practicing small acts of independence from group, making at least one decision weekly based purely on analysis, not others' behavior, developing comfort with standing alone, seeking truth rather than social approval, and tracking conformity patterns in your decisions. Following crowd guarantees mediocre outcomes. Independent thinking enables exceptional results. Think independently or follow masses. You understand now that primitive brain follows crowd automatically. That conformity was survival instinct, now liability. That social proof leads to poor decisions. That independent thinking requires resisting group pressure. And that Chapter 5 reveals how conformity sabotages results, making independent analysis possible, where social proof made it impossible. Chapter 6. Emotional reactions override strategic thinking under pressure. Understanding how emotional reactions from primitive brain override strategic thinking under pressure reveals why smart people make stupid decisions in critical moments. The emotion versus reason conflict demonstrates that primitive brain responds to pressure with immediate emotional reaction. That emotional response happens faster than rational thought. That pressure amplifies primitive control. That maintaining rational thinking under stress requires deliberate practice. and that smart thinking demands emotional regulation. Most people fail under pressure through reacting emotionally when strategic thinking is required, making impulsive decisions driven by anger, fear, or excitement, losing access to rational brain during stress, saying or doing things that destroy relationships or opportunities, and unable to think clearly when it matters most. Emotional reactions destroy critical decisions. Rational pause enables smart thinking. Pause before deciding or react destructively. Research on stress and decision-making demonstrates that acute stress impairs prefrontal cortex rational function, that emotional reactions from amygdala happen before cortical processing, that pressure causes regression to primitive automatic responses, that emotional regulation training improves decision quality, and that maintaining rational thought under pressure is trainable skill. The manifestation includes sending angry email, destroying professional relationship, making fear-based decisions that lock in losses, impulsive reactions during arguments damaging relationships, excitement-driven choices, ignoring obvious risks, and pressure causing poor decisions despite knowing better. The smart thinking strategies involve recognizing physiological signs of emotional activation, implementing mandatory pause before any decision under pressure, using structured decision protocols preventing emotional override, practicing responses to predictable pressure situations, treating emotional state as signal to slow down, not speed up, and never making important decisions in emotional states. The pause protocol means when feeling strong emotion, implement 10-second breathing pause, asking, am I in state to make smart decision right now? Waiting for emotional intensity to decrease before deciding, using if emotional then pause rule automatically, treating pressure as trigger for caution, not action, and maintaining discipline to delay decisions until rational. The implementation requires identifying pressure situations that trigger emotional reactions, pre-planning responses to predictable scenarios, practicing emotional regulation techniques daily, creating rules preventing emotional decisions, tracking emotional decisions to increase awareness, and developing capacity to maintain rational thought during stress. Emotional reactions destroy critical decisions. Rational pause enables smart thinking. Pause before deciding or react destructively. You understand now that primitive brain reacts emotionally under pressure, that emotional response overrides rational thought, that pressure amplifies primitive control, that mandatory pause enables strategic thinking, and that Chapter 6 reveals how emotions sabotage critical decisions, making rational response possible where emotional reaction made it impossible. Chapter 7. Availability bias makes vivid recent events seem more common than reality. Understanding how availability bias makes vivid recent events seem more common than statistical reality reveals how primitive brain miscalculates actual risk and opportunity. The availability bias demonstrates that primitive brain judges frequency by ease of recalling examples, that vivid dramatic events are remembered disproportionately, that recent occurrences seem more common than they are, that this bias causes systematic miscalculation of probability, and that smart thinking requires statistical reality, not emotional memory. Most people are misled by availability bias through overestimating rare dramatic risks, underestimating common undramatic risks, making decisions based on recent examples, not actual frequency, being influenced by vivid stories more than statistics, and miscalculating probabilities throughout life. Vivid memory distorts actual probability. Statistical thinking reveals reality. Use data or miscalculate constantly. Research on availability bias demonstrates that people overestimate death by dramatic causes and underestimate death by common causes, that recent market movements disproportionately influence investment decisions, that vivid anecdotes override statistical base rates, that media coverage creates availability bias by making rare events seem common, and that correcting this bias requires conscious statistical thinking. The manifestation includes avoiding air travel after crash news, despite driving being far more dangerous, making investment decisions based on recent performance, ignoring long-term data, judging risk based on memorable examples, not actual probability, being influenced by dramatic stories more than boring statistics, and miscalculating likelihood of events throughout life. The smart thinking override involves asking what are actual statistics, not just memorable examples, seeking base rate information before judging frequency, recognizing when vivid memory is distorting probability assessment, using statistical thinking to correct emotional impressions, distinguishing between availability and actuality, and making decisions based on data, not stories. The statistical thinking practice means looking up actual frequencies before judging commonality, calculating real probabilities, not relying on memory, seeking multiple data sources, not vivid anecdotes, treating statistics as more reliable than impressions, using base rates to correct emotional assessments, and making probability-based decisions. The implementation requires identifying decisions where availability bias influenced you, developing habit of asking what are actual statistics, seeking data before making probability judgments, consciously correcting for vivid recent examples, tracking instances where memory distorted reality, and using statistical thinking systematically. Vivid memory distorts actual probability. Statistical thinking reveals reality. Use data or miscalculate constantly. You understand now that primitive brain judges probability by memory vividness, that recent dramatic events seem more common than they are, that this bias systematically miscalculates risk, that statistical thinking corrects emotional impressions, and that Chapter 7 reveals how availability bias distorts probability, making database decisions possible where emotional memory made it impossible. Chapter 8. Anchoring bias makes initial numbers irrationally influence all estimates. Understanding how anchoring bias makes arbitrary initial numbers irrationally influence subsequent estimates reveals how primitive brain is manipulated by irrelevant information. The anchoring principle demonstrates that primitive brain uses first number encountered as reference point, that subsequent estimates are adjusted from anchor, that completely irrelevant anchors influence judgments, that this bias operates even when anchor is obviously random, and that smart thinking requires recognizing and resisting anchors. Most people are controlled by anchoring through negotiating from initial offer rather than fair value, being influenced by asking price in evaluations, estimating based on arbitrary starting numbers, unable to ignore irrelevant anchors, and making biased judgments throughout life. Anchoring bias allows manipulation. Independent evaluation reveals value. Resist anchors or be controlled. Research on anchoring demonstrates that showing people random numbers before estimate influences their answer. That initial salary offer affects final negotiated amount. That asking price affects property valuations by professionals. That anchoring operates unconsciously and is difficult to eliminate, and that awareness of bias does not prevent its effect. The manifestation includes negotiating salary based on arbitrary first offer, evaluating property value influenced by asking price, estimating project timelines anchored to initial guess, being influenced by suggested donation amounts, making financial decisions based on reference points, and judging value relative to anchor, not absolute merit. The smart thinking override involves recognizing when anchor has been established, deliberately ignoring initial number provided, generating independent estimate before seeing others' numbers, asking what would I estimate if I had no anchor, using multiple reference points, not single anchor, and treating first number as irrelevant until validated. The negotiation application means refusing to make first offer in important negotiations, resetting anchor by providing justified number, recognizing when opponent is using anchoring, generating independent valuation before discussions, not being psychologically bound by initial number, and making decisions based on value, not reference point. The implementation requires identifying situations where anchoring influenced your decisions, practicing independent estimation before seeing others' numbers, consciously resetting anchors in negotiations, asking what is actual value independent of reference point, tracking anchoring effects in your judgments, and developing resistance to arbitrary numbers. Anchoring bias allows manipulation. Independent evaluation reveals value. Resist anchors or be controlled. You understand now that primitive brain uses first number as reference point, that irrelevant anchors influence subsequent estimates, that this bias operates unconsciously, that independent evaluation is essential, and that Chapter 8 reveals how anchoring manipulates judgment, making independent valuation possible where anchor influence made it impossible. Chapter 9. Sunk cost fallacy makes you continue failed paths. Irrationally. Understanding how sunk cost fallacy makes you irrationally continue failed paths because of past investment reveals how primitive brains, loss, aversion, destroys smart decisions. The sunk cost principle demonstrates that past costs that cannot be recovered should not influence future decisions. That primitive brain hates admitting loss and wasted effort. That continuing bad investment to avoid accepting sunk cost compounds losses. That smart thinking requires ignoring sunk costs completely. And that cutting losses quickly is prerequisite for success. Most people are trapped by sunk cost fallacy through continuing failing business because of money already invested, staying in wrong career because of years already spent, maintaining bad relationships to justify past investment, finishing worthless projects because already started, and unable to quit losing positions. Sunk cost fallacy compounds losses. Smart thinking cuts losses quickly. Ignore past costs or destroy future. Research on sunk cost fallacy demonstrates that people continue failing investments to avoid accepting loss. That greater sunk costs increase commitment to failing path. That this fallacy causes massive wealth destruction. That smart decision-making requires forward-looking analysis only. And that successful people cut losses quickly while failures hold forever. The manifestation includes holding losing investment hoping to break even, staying in wrong career because of education investment, continuing failing business throwing good money after bad, maintaining dysfunctional relationship because of years invested, and completing worthless project because already started. The smart thinking override involves asking, what would I do if I was starting fresh today? Recognizing that sunk costs are irrelevant to future decisions, treating past investment as lesson not chain, being willing to admit mistake and cut losses, making decisions based purely on forward value not backward cost, and viewing quick loss cutting as intelligence not failure. The loss cutting practice means identifying sunk costs in your life currently, asking honestly, is continuing optimal decision, ignoring past, being willing to quit losing positions, treating admission of mistake as strength, cutting losses before they compound, and making forward-looking decisions only. The implementation requires reviewing current commitments, identifying sunk costs, asking, would I choose this if starting fresh, being willing to abandon failed paths, practicing small acts of loss cutting, building tolerance, tracking sunk cost decisions, and developing identity as person who cuts losses quickly. Sunk cost fallacy compounds losses. Smart thinking cuts losses quickly. Ignore past costs or destroy future. You understand now that primitive brain hates admitting wasted effort, that continuing bad investments to avoid accepting loss compounds damage, that sunk costs are irrelevant to optimal decisions, that cutting losses quickly is essential, and that Chapter 9 reveals how sunk cost fallacy destroys wealth, making forward-looking decisions possible where backward-looking fallacy made it impossible. Chapter 10. Practice rationale override daily, making smart thinking automatic. Practicing rationale override of primitive instincts daily makes smart thinking increasingly automatic, rather than requiring constant effort. The automaticity principle demonstrates that overriding primitive instincts requires deliberate practice, that repeated override creates new automatic patterns, that smart thinking becomes easier with consistent practice, that building rational habits replaces primitive reactions, and that permanent smart thinking requires permanent practice. Most people never develop smart thinking through occasional override attempts without consistency, expecting rational thought to be automatic without training, not practicing override in low-stakes situations, failing to build habits that support rational thinking, and treating smart thinking as knowledge, not skill, requiring practice. Occasional override creates nothing permanent. Daily practice builds automatic smart thinking. Practice consistently or stay primitive. Research on habit formation and automaticity demonstrates that consistent practice creates automatic patterns, that rational thinking improves with deliberate training, that neuroplasticity allows primitive override to become habitual, that daily practice is required for permanent change, and that smart thinking is skill requiring systematic development. The daily practice protocol includes identifying one primitive instinct to override today, implementing deliberate pause before any automatic reaction, questioning whether emotional impulse or rational analysis is driving decision, practicing override in small decisions, building capacity, tracking rational versus primitive decisions daily, celebrating successful overrides, reinforcing pattern, and treating smart thinking as daily practice, not occasional effort. The automaticity development means initial override requires significant conscious effort. Repeated practice makes override easier over time. Smart thinking patterns become increasingly automatic. Primitive instincts still arise, but rational override happens faster. And permanent practice creates permanent smart thinking capacity. The progressive training involves starting with easiest overrides, building confidence, gradually tackling more difficult primitive reactions, practicing in various contexts and situations, maintaining consistency even when difficult, celebrating progress, tracking improvement, using successful overrides as evidence of capability, and treating development as long-term project. The implementation requires committing to daily rational override practice, choosing specific primitive instinct to focus on, implementing structured pause before reactions, tracking primitive versus rational decisions, reviewing patterns weekly, identifying progress, maintaining practice indefinitely not temporarily, and treating smart thinking as permanent lifestyle requiring permanent effort. Occasional override creates nothing permanent. Daily practice builds automatic smart thinking. Practice consistently or stay primitive. You understand now that rational override requires consistent practice, that repeated override creates automatic patterns, that smart thinking becomes habitual through training, that daily practice is non-negotiable, and that Chapter 10 reveals how consistent practice makes smart thinking automatic, where primitive control dominated before. You have learned how to think smart by outsmarting your primitive instincts. Your primitive brain controls most decisions unconsciously. Loss aversion makes you fear risk irrationally. Immediate gratification destroys long-term planning. Confirmation bias blinds you to truth. Social proof makes you follow crowds. Emotions override strategy under pressure. Availability bias distorts probability. Anchoring influences estimates. Sunk cost, fallacy, compounds, losses. Daily practice makes rational override automatic. What matters now is implementing these insights starting immediately. 5. Implementation priorities starting today. Recognize when primitive brain is controlling decisions. Implement pause before emotional reactions. Seek statistical reality over emotional impressions. Make at least one decision daily by rational analysis, overriding instinct. Practice systematic override building, automatic smart thinking. Execute these practices consistently, build rational capacity progressively, and develop smart thinking. Stop being controlled by primitive instincts, and start thinking smart systematically. Stop making irrational decisions, and start outsmarting your primitive brain. Master rational thinking, override instinctive reactions, recognize cognitive traps, execute strategic choices, and develop smart thinking capacity, making rational decisions possible that primitive control makes permanently impossible through commitment, starting now.